Hi, this is Arvid from Econ Explains. And today we are going to be talking about how you can increase both truthful reporting by auditors and reduce pollution at the same time. And the setting is that all around the world, governments have implemented regulations to improve the lives of their citizens regarding finance, related to investments, or related to the quality of products, or regarding pollution. Because governments often limit the amount of pollution that firms can do, air pollution, water pollution, in order to protect the health of their citizens. But in order to enforce this policy and basically reprimand the firms that are violating the policy, you need to know, well, how much are firms polluting? Because firms might not always report it to the government. So how do you know? Well, the governments often don't have the expertise themselves or the resources to implement all these audits for firms when it comes to pollution. So what they do is they set up a third-party audit system. What does that mean? Well, it means that the government isn't doing the audit, but a private firm is doing the audit. In addition, firms that are being audited get to choose and pay the auditors. Now, that's all good, and sometimes the system works great, but because the firms get to choose and pay the auditors, this can lead to a problem. Basically, where the auditors are feeling the pressure to be more lenient towards their client or risk losing it. For example, if they're too truthful, the firm might say, well, we get some other auditor who is maybe more lenient towards me. Now, while we know that this conflict of interest is always there, it's often hard to get research done about it because you need to know what's actually the case, you need to know what auditors do. So it's often a hard topic to tackle. But 4 top economists did exactly this in one of my all-time favorite papers. And I'm very excited to share it with you. These authors are Ester Duflo, who won a Nobel Prize, Michael Greenstone, Nicholas Ryan, and Rohini Pande. And they studied third-party audits related to pollution in the state of Gujarat. And Gujarat is a province in India that accounted in 2004 for 20% of India's output, but only 5% of its population. So really it's a very industrial state. And it's known tremendous economic growth, but as a result of that, it has also known great pollution. So in 74, 81, and 86, pollution regulations were implemented at the national level in India. But in 1996, the Gujarat Pollution Board implemented a third-party audit system to get measurements of firms' pollution. But in flash forward to 2009, at the time of the paper, where the regulator told the authors that it basically did not believe the pollution measurements that were coming out of the audit reports. It basically thought that that pollution was much higher than was actually reported. So to check this, the authors, in collaboration with the pollution board and supported by fellowships, hired independent auditors and they basically went out and checked if this was actually the case. So in the first graph, we're going to see the status quo air pollution measurements by the auditors. And as you can see on the graph, on the horizontal axis, we have air pollution. And the black line shows the maximum amount that a firm can pollute according to a specific measurement. So anything to the right should be prohibited, anything to the left is allowed. On the vertical axis, we have measurement of the percentage of firms that are reported in each bar, basically. And what do we see? Basically, we see that 93% of firms are compliant with the regulation as reported, because they're all to the left of the black line. And there's only 7% of firms that are actually polluting above the threshold. So if you look at these numbers, this would be a great result. Now, if we look at the back checks, basically verifying the actual emissions, a different picture emerges. Because what do we see? We see that this bunching just below the black line kind of disappears and measurements are much more spread out. And the most important result is there's a lot more firms that are polluting that are on the right of the black line and are thus in violation of the regulation. So in that sense, the regulator was right not to trust these audit reports. And the authors conclude that there's a real incentive problem here, that auditors are basically pressured if they want to get hired again, if they want to keep their job, or even provide food for their family, to basically misreport pollution. Interestingly enough, there's also firms that are polluting much less than allowed, but are reported in the status quo to be just below the black line. And why is that? Well, the authors found that sometimes audit firms are paid a price that is actually below the cost of doing an audit, which requires a four-man team, several inspections, you need the equipment, and then you need to get the results analyzed in a laboratory. So if the price you're getting to the audit is less than the actual cost of an audit, they basically say, well, there might be an incentive to base the reported measurements on something else, basically made up data, but then it's less suspicious to report it just to below the threshold than actually being way less than it actually is, because you don't actually know at that point. Okay, so we know there's misreporting by auditors. So what do? Give up? Go home? Not with these authors. These authors implemented an economic experiment whereby they tried to reduce the incentives for misreporting among auditors. What did they do? Well, first, they're going to randomly allocate auditors, so they are no longer chosen by the firm. Second, they're going to pay the auditor from a central pool of money, so they no longer get paid by the firm. And third, they're going to ensure that the auditors get paid a price that's sufficient to cover the audit cost plus a small margin. And fourth, they also are going to do 20% random back checks on auditors. While auditors were told that this would not have any impact on their credibility or their certification, as the authors point out, they might not believe the authors and think, okay, maybe I do some better effort. But this is only for 20%. So we have random allocation, we have a central pool of money, we have a sufficient price to cover the costs, and some occasional back checks. So now with the treatment in place, what do we get? We get the graphs on the right. And these graphs are cool because what we see that with the treatment is that auditors basically now report a spread and also more firms that are now in violation. Basically, the graph on the top right, reported emissions, is very similar to the back checks in the status quo, indicating that that reporting has already become much more truthful than it used to be. And back checks for the auditors in the treatment basically show that results are kind of similar. So basically, auditors in the treatment, subject to these changes, are now reporting much more truthfully. Or putting it more quantitatively, a firm that is violating the law is 81% less likely to be reported as compliant with the regulation in the treatment than before. So, very good news. But there's a third result because of this. Because if you think about it, if you're a firm that's polluting, and now you know you're going to get an auditor that is not chosen by you, is not paid by you, they're more likely to report the truth to the regulator. So if you are violating, and you probably know you are, then you're in trouble. In addition, in Gujarat, there's very severe penalties for firms that are violating a lot. So not just a little bit over the threshold, but if you're a lot over the threshold, there's penalties in place that can basically cut off your electricity, stopping your production, or just shutting your plant down altogether. So what the authors find is, because this was a 2-year experiment, is that throughout the experiment, because they sometimes did measurements along certain points, is that the most extreme violators already started to reduce their pollution during the experiment. Which is huge, because that's what the regulations are there for in the first place, to reduce pollution and protect the health of citizens. So, to recap, in the status quo, we have corrupt reporting. With the treatment, basically auditors are reporting more truthfully. And then third, if you have more truthful reporting, firms are going to be more compliant with the regulation, and they started to reduce their pollution. Now, of course, in the paper, there's a couple of caveats, and they do a lot of discussion of how these results can generalize, and I recommend reading it. I won't go into it in much detail. They, for example, discuss the fact, for example, that in financial markets, products can be more complex. There should be some startup costs, but you can do random allocation of auditors for, say, a 2 or 3 year period. So there's ways to deal with difficulties sector by sector. You also would need some knowledge of the institution, the sector, and so on and so on. But the key takeaway of this paper is anything that can reduce the incentive problem is going to increase truthful reporting. So can you allocate auditors randomly? Can you make sure that auditors are, for example, not paid by the firm, but from a central pool of money? Can you make sure that the auditors are paid a wage that covers their costs? And fourth, can you do occasional back checks on the auditors or even make penalties more severe? Any one of these likely is to lead to more truthful reporting. Of course, there could be some interaction effects and so on and so on. So with that being said, I would say go out and reduce incentive problems. Thank you for watching.